Levels of equivalence and the concept of adequate translation. Levels of equivalence. This problem was briefly discussed in the previous lecture in connection with the distinction between semantic and pragmatic equivalence. In the theory of translation, different ideas have been put forward concerning the types and levels of equivalence in translation. For example, Gach and Levin distinguish the following types of equivalence: formal, semantic, and situational. Formal equivalence may be illustrated by such cases as the sun disappeared behind a cloud. Солнце скрылось за тучей. Here we find similarity of words and forms in addition to the similarity of meanings. The differences in the plan of expression are in fact those determined by overall structural differences between Russian and English, the use of articles in English, the use of the perfective aspect, gender forms, etc. in Russian. Semantic equivalence exists when the same meanings are expressed in the two languages in a different way. Troops were airlifted to the battlefield. Войска были переброшены по воздуху на поле боя. The English verb airlift contains the same meaning as the Russian phrase перебросить по воздуху. Although different linguistic devices are used in Russian and in English, a word group and a compound group, the sum of semantic components is the same. Situational equivalence is established between utterances that differ both in linguistic devices used and in the semantic components expressed. Barth nevertheless described the same extralinguistic situation: to let someone pass, уступить дорогу. It should be noted that formal equivalence alone is insufficient. In fact, the above equivalents pertain to the types of semantic equivalence: semantic equivalence plus formal equivalence, or the second type, semantic equivalence without formal equivalence. As to situational equivalence, it is in our view another variety of semantic equivalence that differs from the first type in that it is based not on the same semantic components but on the equivalence of meanings, made up of different semantic components. In other words, the sum of different semantic components may be semantically equivalent: A plus B equivalent to C plus D, upside down equivalent to вверх ногами. We shall therefore speak of two types of semantic equivalence: componential, identity of semantic components, and referential equivalence of different semantic components. The latter is preferable to situational equivalence, for descriptions of the same situation are not necessarily equivalent. We may thus distinguish the following levels of equivalence: formal equivalence, semantic equivalence, and pragmatic equivalence. There is a fundamental difference between formal equivalence on the one hand and semantic and pragmatic equivalence on the other hand. Formal equivalence may accompany semantic and pragmatic equivalence, but it is by no means mandatory. It has been pointed out that the translator does not set himself the task of preserving the syntactic relations of the original, nor does he aim at formal equivalence between the original and the translation. Usually, formal equivalence results from the similarity of grammatical forms and lexical items of the two languages, but it does not arise out of a deliberate effort. Adequate translation may be defined, therefore, as that which is determined by semantic and pragmatic equivalence between the original and the target language text. Cases of formal equivalence without semantic or pragmatic equivalence are usually described as literal translation. Literal translation reproduces the linguistic form of the original, regardless of semantic or pragmatic equivalence. It may reproduce the morphological and sound form, as for instance in Tchaikovsky's well-known examples, compositor for compositor. Cherry orchard, cherry orchard, instead of вишневый сад. It may also reproduce lexical items overlooking the idiomatic meaning of the phrase. God bless my soul. Боже, благослови мою душу. In other words, literal translation reproduces the form at the expense of the meaning and distorts the original. In some cases, it may violate the stylistic norm, as for instance in reproducing the syntactic form of the original message. It was he who did it. Это был он, кто это сделал. Adequate literary translation. Grammatical and lexical parallelisms between the source language and the target language make it possible in some cases to retain formal equivalence without departing from semantic or pragmatic equivalence. Otherwise, various lexical grammatical transformations are used. Citation. It is intuition of the translator that can help to avoid literalism, but it will either be insufficient without theoretical knowledge. Алексей Кунтич. Вопросы перевода. 1955. Literal translation does not mean translating a chain of sentences. For producing adequate translation, it is necessary to realize the image of the whole text in its entity. Vygotsky wrote that a word gains its meaning only in a phrase in a sentence in a paragraph in a book, and a book in the creative work of the author. A translator's activity has receptive and reproducive character. First, he should understand the foreign text, then create a text in the target language. In the process of understanding, several sentences are analyzed first. A definite cognitive structure is made up from their content elements. The analysis of the text done using denotational referential approach helps to distinguish the hierarchy of denotation of the whole text. All these will help the translator to have the image of the text in his mind. It is very important for this image to coincide with the image that the author of the target language text intended to reveal. Factors contributing to the adequacy of literary translation. To achieve adequacy of literary translation alongside with the perfect knowledge of specific story features of systems of both the source language and the target language, the translator must possess the required amount of knowledge. First of all, the traditions, customs, and living conditions of the personages of the literary work. The history of the country the scene was laid in. The time the scene is laid in. Creative works of the author on the whole, the style of the author, and the peculiarities of the literary work. Russian translator Wright Kovaleva was an editor when the novel Village, which is the part of the trilogy by Faulkner, was translated. One of the main personages, Julia Warner, appears in this novel for the first time. She is still a child, but she becomes mature very early. She is lazy, passive, and slow. The translator did not quite catch that she was to grow up to be Helen the Beauty. She was the real embodiment of the eternal femininity, so he used more colloquial words describing her appearance. It resulted in the heroine becoming rather rude and plain in the target language text, quite different from the heroine of the original text. Then the translator has read the whole trilogy once again. Quite different intonation and different sets of words were used then. Her lips became not толстые, but пухлые. Walk not ленивая, but с линцой. The complexion not бесцветная, but матовая. And Julia looked at the world not коровьими глазами, but волооким взглядом.